Yeah.
Well, welcome everybody who's here this evening. Welcome to our online discussion. We'll begin in around a minute or so, I think, roughly. Wait for one or two more people to see if they arrive. So this is a Zoom by the English Catholic History Association, which is an association, obviously, for English Catholic or English and Welsh Catholic history. It was set up a number of years ago, and we do regular Zoom talks. We had one on Tuesday this week. There are more talks on the website as well coming up later this year, and already booking up ones for next year. We're quite excited with the number of speakers we're getting and the number of very eminent speakers. I think next year we're going to have Dr. Francis Young, for example. Great fan of Dr. Francis Young and his work. So that will be sometime in the spring next year, I think. Good. Let's see how many people we've got now. We've got 17, I think. I'll mention now that it's going to be recorded. It is being recorded, I think, so hopefully nobody minds. We'll be putting it on the ECHA YouTube channel within a few days, probably, as well. There's a chat box as well. You'll probably see at the bottom of your screen. It says chat, and I'm just going to type welcome everybody. There we are. So if you have questions at all, if you wish to put them in the chat box, you can. If you don't wish to, that's also fine. It's up to you. So I think we're probably ready to begin. So anyway, welcome to our ECHA pilgrimage discussion this evening. Got some very distinguished speakers today. I'm not sure, have we got Anne Bailey here at the moment? Not yet. Okay, so we've got Dr. Phil McCarthy. So I think he's linked with the Department of Theology and Religion at Birmingham University, I believe. Hope that's correct. Anyway, I hope this is correct. Former GP in Bristol. Various leadership positions in the health service in the West Country. In 2015, awarded an MSc in Global Ethics. He's been CEO of Caritas Social Action Network, co-chair of the Centre for Catholic Social Thought and Practice, and board member of Caritas Europa, and more recently set up the Hearts in Search of God project, which is where I came across Dr. McCarthy. We've hopefully got Dr. Anne Bailey. If she isn't here, so hopefully she will be soon. Anne is based at the University of Oxford, where she is associate member of the history faculty and part-time tutor for the part-time education courses, adult education courses that they run. She's published widely on medieval and modern pilgrimage and uses her research on modern pilgrimage to gain a deeper understanding of contemporary pilgrimage and practice in Western tradition. We've got Dr. John Eade, Professor John Eade, Professor of Sociology and Anthropology at the University of Roehampton, Research Fellow at the Department for the Study of Religion at the University of Toronto, co-founder of the Routledge Religion and Travel and Tourism series, and research interests and publications focused on anthropology of pilgrimage, etc. We've also got Andy Bull, and I'm just reaching for his book here, just a quick plug. London to Walsingham Camino. He's written two books that I've got anyway. Pilgrim Pathways is one of them. I don't really can see that, which is a very good book on 1- and 2-day pilgrimages. And also London to Walsingham Camino, which is a more recent publication. And I went to the launch of his book in London, and in fact he signed it for me. Andy Bull is a keen walker, journalist and author, who has written travel pieces for The Times, The Telegraph, The Independent, The Mail on Sunday, and The Tablet. He has also written Pilgrim Pathways, 1 to 2 days walks on Britain's ancient sacred ways for Trailblazer Publications. In researching that book, he was surprised to find that the pilgrim route from London to Walsingham was the most important path for pre-Reformation times, but was not on maps. When he discovered that the route had died out, he resolved to re-establish it, and this book is a result. And he has also published 2 travel books on America, Coast to Coast and Strange Angels, Guides for Mountain Bikers to the Lake District and the Ridgeway, The War and Walking, Charles Dickens is Kent. He's written a local history book, Secret Isle of Wight, A to Z of Ealing, A to Z of Bexhill-on-Sea, and he's now working on a further guidebook, Walking Cornwall's Myths and Legends. So welcome to everybody this evening. And I'm Tim Guile, I'm Chairman of the English Catholic History Association. So I'll read you a little bit about pilgrimage and its kind of background. And this is actually from the Hearts in Search of God website. So Dr. Philip McCarthy will have heard this before. Holy places from long ago may still resonate with travellers, pilgrims and visitors to England and Wales today. Medieval English and Welsh people were strongly attached to veneration of the Blessed Virgin Mary and the saints, that they were known to go on pilgrimages both within the country and abroad. The tradition of the cult of saints and pilgrimage to holy places is historically evident and was largely suppressed at the time of the Reformation in the 16th century. This tradition of pilgrimage has been revived in modern times and is now part of the rich tapestry of our history, archaeology, faith, and heritage. Alongside those who would identify with the Christian community at large, lots of people have no religious beliefs at all, may indeed be antagonistic to organised religion, may also be interested in pilgrimage. However, many of them may have an ambivalent attitude to places, people, and events with connotations of religion, faith, and spirituality or belief. They clearly mean something and can engender inquiry or even fascination for some. The influence of the Church may have waned substantially in Britain in recent years and in other countries in Western Europe, but pilgrimage is still popular with growing numbers of people. Pilgrimage is often associated with the Catholic tradition. A pilgrimage is a journey that pilgrims make to a place that is considered holy. To Catholics, a pilgrimage is more than just travelling to historic sites and viewing religious relics. It's a journey with a deeper and more spiritual meaning. The definition of pilgrimage can be interpreted more widely than that. Pilgrimages do not have to be just for Christians. They are for anyone and everyone. A pilgrimage is a devotional practice consisting of a prolonged journey, often undertaken on foot or on horseback, towards a specific destination of significance. It's a short-term experience, removing the participants from his or her home environment and identity. The means or motivations in undertaking pilgrimage may vary, but the act, however performed, blends the physical and the spiritual into unified experience. A motivation for going on pilgrimage for some medieval people was to gain an indulgence from the Pope. An indulgence in Catholic theology is the full or partial remission of punishment for sins. Therefore, the pilgrims were able to visit the shrine of a local or a faraway saint to gain sanctioned indulgence. But some visited for another reason altogether, the hope of healing for a personal malady or for the health of a loved one. This practice has been a huge influence, not only on the spiritual history of the British Isles, but on the physical infrastructure as well. Roots have been laid down by the feet of the faithful, glorious buildings made possible by the donations of those who visit the place where relics lay in state, and a network of abbeys built to support the needs of those travellers. Everywhere one looks, in our towns and cities, we see buildings connected in some way with the pilgrimage story of our ancestors. The final fall of Jerusalem in 1453 meant that European sites such as Rome and Santiago de Compostela in Spain became the main goal of those wishing to make a lengthy pilgrimage. Pilgrims began visiting the shrine of St. James in the 10th century. First recorded English pilgrims arrived in the late 11th century, and by the 12th century was highly organised. During the Middle Ages, people made pilgrimages for a variety of reasons. Many holy sites were believed to have healing powers, such as Holy Wells or the shrine at Walsingham in Norfolk. Pilgrims who had a sick loved one would seek divine help at a place like this, along with people who were ill themselves, and people who had recovered from illnesses could also come to give thanks to God. Penitents would also undertake pilgrimage to gain forgiveness for their sins, or to shorten time in purgatory for themselves or others. Basically, as a pilgrimage was a journey of faith, anything a person felt they needed God's help for would be a motivation for the journey. Pilgrimages could be long or short. Many medieval English or Welsh pilgrims made short journeys on foot or horseback to local shrines just a few miles away from their homes. Many couldn't afford much time away from the fields or their trade. People made pilgrimages for a variety of reasons. Personal motivations for pilgrimage among the laity were as varied as the individual pilgrims themselves, but can be broadly placed in two categories: the wish to implore divine aid at a shrine on behalf of oneself or a relative, and the opportunity pilgrimage offered in terms of travel and temporary escape from the daily drudgery of everyday life. It can be argued that for the second motivation, it appears it might have been an excuse to shirk responsibilities and duty of a variety of social classes, trades and professions, from the poorest serfs and peasants to wealthy tradesmen, monks and nuns. For this very reason, a pilgrim was expected to have permission from his bishop or superior before setting out, and had to make his affairs in order, often making a will, repaying outstanding debts, and providing for his family in his or her absence. With the popularity of pilgrimage in the late Middle Ages, there were so many people wanting to make pilgrimage to various places, the church had to regulate the practice so that families and work were not neglected. Pilgrims may have assembled in their parish church dressed in the distinctive pilgrim habit and be blessed by the priest. Many pilgrims may have typically worn a long grey gown and a cowl and a broad hat, and carried a staff or scrip or satchel and a bottle. Pilgrims travelled to religious sites all over England. The routes were well established for them on their journeys. Shrines are part of the pilgrimage, and pilgrims may have journeyed from one shrine to another on the way. Routes were generally marked by religious houses, wayside chapels, and stone crosses to aid the pilgrims with their spiritual and temporal needs. Monasteries and hospices offered hospitality. Travelling was very hazardous, with miles of open country or forested countryside, poor tracks, outlaws, wild animals such as wolves and boar. So pilgrims were encouraged to travel in groups. They would assemble, like Chaucer's pilgrims in Canterbury Tales, at inns, as the famous Tabard in Southwark is an example. In their case, it was to travel as a group on horseback to the shrine of Thomas of Canterbury. And they competed for a prize of a meal at a hostelry on the turn for the best tale of each, by each telling two stories on the way and the same on the journey back, according to Chaucer at least. By far the most famous medieval shrine was Our Lady of Walsingham in Norfolk. Erasmus, the Dutch scholar, visited Walsingham in 1513, was impressed by the splendour of the shrine. He was also a little bit cynical about the veneration as well. The main route to Walsingham was from London via towns and religious sites. Pilgrims often visited several shrines en route to a principal shrine. Pilgrimages to Walsingham might include Bronholm Priory to see the relic of the Holy Cross, a visit to the anchorite Mother Julian of Norwich, or to St. William's Shrine in Norwich Cathedral, St. Edmund's Shrine in Bury St. Edmunds in Suffolk, or St. Etheldreda's Shrine at Ely Cathedral. Walsingham, the site where a noblewoman, Richeldis, received a vision telling her to build a replica of the House of the Nativity, rapidly became popular, aided by the establishment of an Augustinian priory there in 1153, and several visits by monarchs. Even Henry VIII visited Walsingham as a pilgrim. So pilgrimage has a lot of historical basis, but it also has a lot of resonance for people today as well, for modern people in the 21st century. And here's some sort of thoughts on that. Alone on a pilgrim way, even on remote stretches of trail, when you don't see another soul, there's always the sense that so many others have walked the same route before you, sometimes for hundreds of years. On popular pilgrim routes, you may be traveling in a group where you can laugh, sing, and get to know fellow pilgrims. I did Student Cross Pilgrim, now called Pilgrim Cross, many years ago in my 20s, and thoroughly enjoyed it with a group of similar young people, and had great fun on our walk all the way from Essex up to Walsingham in Norfolk. And on one occasion we were even filmed by the BBC as well. for a TV programme. Everyone has their own unique experience of a pilgrim walk. The beauty of walking, and of walking an established route like the Pilgrim Way, is that it gives you the time and the space to be away from the demands of daily life, to reconnect with the world around you. Travelling on foot is one of the best ways to absorb the sights, sounds and smells of the places you pass. Whether it's the sweet scent of wildflowers or the lingering smell of cowpat you didn't quite manage to avoid, you'll feel more in touch with the natural world than perhaps you ever have before. When all you have to do that day is to put one foot in front of the other, you'll also find that the rhythm of walking calms your mind and aids reflection, so it becomes a spiritual experience in itself. No matter how long or short your chosen pilgrimage walk is, there are always a fantastic sense of achievement on reaching your goal at the end of the journey. Why not try it for yourself? So that was by way of kind of introduction for our discussion this evening. So first of all, Andy, if I can talk to you, and tell me about your books that you wrote and why you decided to write about pilgrimage, please.
Right. So initially, I'd become vague. I've always liked walking, and I became interested in the idea of pilgrimage. I think partly because I kept hearing so many people going on about walking to Santiago, and I actually didn't fancy going to Spain, but I wanted to walk here. I felt that what I needed was a sort of easy way in. And I came up with this idea, the Weekend Pilgrim, which I was able to sell the idea to a publisher. I really thought what I wanted to do was to encourage people like myself who were interested in pilgrimage but really didn't want to walk hundreds of miles and take 1 or 2 weeks. So I came up with 20, which I hope were very contrasting routes around the country. Most of them in England, a couple in Wales, and one in Scotland. That's the book there, Glastonbury. Yeah. And I really had sort of the approach of trying to mix things up. So unlike Spain, where Santiago is the bee's knees, we have many saints, many places of veneration. Or did have pre-Reformation. Some of them, the obvious big ones, like Canterbury and St. David's and St. Andrew's. If I can be possibly a little facetious, you think of those things, they're like the Premier League, the Premier League of pilgrim sites. But then you've also got the sort of the Championship, which would be Glastonbury and York and one or two others. And then you've got the kind of non-league sides, like the little place like Chiddock, the remarkable Catholic shrine down on the Jurassic coast. And the reason for my mentioning pilgrimage in the same breath as football is, I don't know if any of you like a sport, not necessarily football or anything, but I sort of came into football quite late, just like I did pilgrimage. And what I discovered when I go to a football match and my team scores a goal is, before I know it, I'm on my feet cheering. And I've no idea, there's been no conscious connection to that. And I sort of feel that I would love to feel the same about pilgrimage. And I got quite close when I first saw that remarkable soaring remaining arch at Walsingham, at the site of the shrine there, and that's really what I'm seeking as a pilgrim. I'm seeking that point where you stop thinking about it and your feelings and your emotions take over. And there are points, I think, on pilgrimage when I felt like that. So the first book was really try and get people who, like me, were reluctant pilgrims to go on it. And because, as I say, I had this very clever idea, the Weekend Program, and then came lockdown, and my publisher said, we can't call it that because no one has got weekends. They can't go away for weekends. So we decided to adapt things. So it's now 1 to 2 days, that idea. And then, as Tim mentioned, when I started out on this, I'd known of Walsingham. I didn't really know what Walsingham was. I knew it didn't have a cathedral there, and I knew that there was an Anglican shrine and a Catholic shrine, but that was kind of my limit. But I was surprised, as Tim said, that there wasn't a route to it. You know that if you look on the map, there's the St Cuthbert Way, the Pilgrims Way in Kent, or from Winchester, and they appear on all the survey maps. But there wasn't anything for Walsingham. So I actually, in the first book, did a kind of a 2-day walk. The last bit that medieval pilgrims would have done from London, which is a place called Castle Acre, a 2-day walk, and really thought not much of it. But then I was doing another project, which is actually about the Great North Road, a completely secular project. And I was in Ware, and someone told me, oh, you know, the high street used to be called Walsingham Way. And I'm thinking, that's odd, that's a long way from Walsingham. And a couple of other clues came like that. And so I thought, well, there is something here. You know, I ought to try and retrace this route. And so I got in touch with archivists at both the Anglican and Catholic shrines at Walsingham, and they told me about a book by a Catholic priest called Leonard Watmore, wrote it in 1973. It was called Highway to Walsingham, and in it he did all the historic research about that route. And as you were saying, Tim, it was indeed the most important pilgrim destination. If you compare it to Canterbury, just pre-Reformation, in terms of the offerings made there, £240 a year was being offered at Walsingham, £36 a year at Canterbury. So in terms of its appeal, it was in another league. It was very definitely in the Premiership, and Canterbury was trailing along at the bottom of the Championship and risking relegation down to the First Division.
Walsingham was visited by lots of royalty, lots of aristocrats, lots of famous people, European heads of state, all sorts of things.
Indeed. Henry VIII went twice, at least, Catherine of Aragon, and so on. Anyway, Leonard Watmore did all the research, all the historic research, but he didn't walk it, and he didn't put it on a modern map. So I thought, well, this is the next thing. This is the thing that I can do, because I'm a travel writer. You know, this is the kind of thing I like to do. I needed to make it practical, but it was still lockdown. And I'd been put in touch with an organization called the Confraternity of St. James. And that is designed to encourage British and Irish pilgrims to go to Santiago. They give them lots of help and so on. So I spoke to them and said I had this idea of this project, and they said, well, we've got lots of members who are going stir crazy because they can't go to Santiago. And so we came up with the idea that we would appeal to members along the route, along the kind of putative route, because what I'd done, I'd taken Watmore's route and I'd applied it to modern maps very roughly. So we got these local people who were mad keen on pilgrimage, but couldn't actually go on a pilgrimage to Santiago, to research the bit in the sort of hour that we were allowed, and, you know, in the 5 miles or whatever from our house. They researched it. So we sort of crowdsourced the whole route. And they came back to me and said, Andy, this bit works, this bit doesn't work, or you really should go here, you should go there. So what we hopefully came up with in the end was something which is as close as possible to the medieval route, while taking account of the realities on the ground, and being a stupendous walk in itself, which I believe it is. So, for instance, the first 30 miles out of London, pilgrims would have gone up Ermine Street, which is now the A10, and it's not particularly pleasant unless you like walking through Tottenham and so on. But if you go about a mile or so, or less sometimes, to the east, you come to the Lee Valley. And you can walk up the Lee Valley along the Lee Valley Navigation, or a couple of other rivers, the New River there.
Very pleasant, isn't it? Because I did it with you, didn't I?
Indeed you did. So 30 miles, the first 2 days out of London, without touching tarmac. And I tried to do that all along the way. So linked up paths and so on. And that was it, really. And then Tim was mentioned he was at the launch in London, and then in April I walked the whole route for the first time. I have walked it, 4 or 5 times in bits, but I walked the whole route for the first time, and I appealed to anyone who would like to walk with me. I got a huge number of people said definitely, and that whittled down in the end to me and 2 others, which was fine, actually. And that was a remarkable experience, because I walked with a Catholic, Antonio Moffat, who is the outreach officer at the Catholic Shrine, and Sarah Gunn, who is, well, at the time was a curate at St Mary's Church in Bury St Edmunds, and in fact she was ordained last Saturday. I went to ordination. Now Sarah wore her dog collar all the way, and at first I thought, I wonder how people are going to react. And the reaction was remarkable. We went through all these villages and we told people we were coming. So very kindly, people met us in the church and gave us pilgrim lunch and so on. We'd also invited the 50 churches along the route to have pilgrim stamps, which 20 of them did. So we got these wonderful welcomes in the church. But usually there were 2 or 3 people in the church, and we would talk to them about, so what's the congregation like? Well, Sarah would particularly, and they'd say, well, 6, and one bloke said, he was the church warden, he just put his finger up and said, me. But when we went on our overnight stops to the village pub, the pub would be packed. And Sarah in her dog collar, these people didn't go to church, and they thought, the vicar's come in. So they would come over and say, Vicar, lovely to meet you. And it struck me as this kind of remarkable way that you know, we talk about why people go on pilgrimage, and many of them are not religious, or they say they're spiritual, or they like the idea of the heritage and so on, and everyone loves English churches and hopes and prays that they don't all close down. But it was a really interesting thing, and it did occur to me at that point, and more than it had previously, that there could be a kind of lifeline. That I mean, the Catholic Church was even worse. We couldn't find anywhere with a weekday mass anymore. Although when we started out, there were some. But in the Anglican churches, they were limping along. Maybe 2 or 3 people just keeping them going. Essentially a dying tradition as far as I could see. But there was still this receptiveness. When we told people we were going on pilgrimage to Walsingham, they said things like, haven't you got cars? Or that's impossible. But other times they would say, oh right, what's Walsingham? So I'd say, well, look, have you heard about Santiago? And they'd say, oh yeah, Martin Sheen and that film The Way. Yeah. So well, you can do it in England. You can go on a Camino in England. And the other thing was that it was very difficult to persuade the publisher to publish this book, because he said, I can't publish a book about a route where no one is actually walking. I'm not going to make any money. So he had various criteria. It had to be called the London to Walsingham Camino, because Camino has residents, people, the kind of people we were trying to appeal to, know about Caminos, they know about Santiago, but they don't know about Walsingham. We had to get these pilgrim stamps in all the churches, and we had to do a clever thing that you can do through the Confraternity of St. James, because that has a power deputed to it from the cathedral authorities in Santiago to designate routes in the British Isles as Camino Inglés, kind of feeder routes that, if there's enough evidence that medieval pilgrims would have walked them and also walked to Santiago, you can establish them as these feeder routes. And there is a deal they have, which if you walk at least 25 kilometers on the London to Walsingham Camino, or indeed about 12 other routes, and collect pilgrim stamps along the way, hence we have the 20 pilgrim stamps, it counts for 25 kilometers, counts towards the 100 kilometers minimum you must walk in Spain to reach Santiago. So what that means is if you've done 25 kilometers in England, when you get to Spain, you only have to walk 75. And that means you can go on the shortest route in Spain, from a port called A Coruña, which was one of the 2 places where traditionally English pilgrims went to. So essentially what I hope that's done is it's opened up the possibility of walking not just to Walsingham, or part of the way to Walsingham, but also to Santiago, to people who might only have a week, or you know, they can do a couple of days here and maybe 4 days there. So sorry Tim, slightly long-winded, but that's really the story of it.
Yeah, 1 or 2 things to pick up on there. I think roads do give clues to the original intended place. I'm thinking about drover roads, for example, from Wales to London. There are plenty of Welsh ways and that sort of thing around. So that gave a clue to the actual original use of some of the paths and roads from long ago. And possibly the more research that's done on pilgrimage, more will turn up about the actual routes, because actually mapping these routes is very difficult. I know the British Pilgrimage Trust did a lot of work on looking at one particular medieval map to try to work out the route from Southampton to, well originally I think from Winchester to Canterbury, and then from Southampton to Canterbury, and found it very difficult. And they also, one of their problems was some of the roads are, as you said, A roads now, dual carriageways and things like that. Nobody wants to walk on a dual carriageway and risk their life. So they had to adapt basically. So William Parsons, for example, walked it, I think a few years ago, 5 years ago, from Southampton to Canterbury, and I kind of followed his journey along there. And he publishes a route there, and the British Pilgrimage Trust, I think it's probably the same route as well. If you pay them a bit of money, they'll give you a route map of how to get there. I think it takes about 10, 12 days or something in all, depending on how fast you walk. But that seems to be quite an amazing pilgrimage. That was a medieval origin. Often people from the continent came to the port of Southampton and then walked from there, I think, to Netley Abbey, and then beyond there to various hostelries, various chapels, various places. And there were places to stay, many, many places. I remember once being shown a house in Bath on the way out of Bath on the road to Wells. And this person said, this used to be a pilgrim hostel long ago on the route to Wells.
That's very interesting. I had a similar experience recently, because Santiago is a sort of a centre of many routes leading from all over the place, and Walsingham was too. So there were routes from Ely and Norwich, which have been re-established. But there are also many other routes from ports, people either coming in from the continent or coming down from the north, or a two-way stretch. And there's a village called Sharrington, which a friend of mine was walking through, and he met a chap who said, "Oh, my house was a pilgrim hostelry," and he said, he contacted me and said, "Can that be right?" So I looked in my trusty Whatmore, and indeed it was. Whatmore identifies a number of other routes across Norfolk. So the sort of my ambition is to try and do what I can to make Walsingham as significant a centre for walking pilgrimage. I know it's very significant for people who go on coaches or in their cars, but as significant in the English context as Santiago is in Spanish context.
Yes, excellent. I think there were many, many routes to these different places, and there were local shrines. Every town virtually had a shrine and a church. I mean, where I live, there was a shrine to St. Edburgh, which was a local pilgrim route. It wasn't a national one, but it was a local one. And although it was suppressed, the priory there was suppressed in the 16th century, some of the shrine actually survived. The person who was tasked with actually removing the priory actually saved some of the shrine and put it in his local village church, where it is to this day. So obviously he was still attached to the veneration of the saints, enough to actually reassemble it, keep the parts and reassemble it in his own church, and got away with it. So there were lots of different pilgrimage places, many, many different routes, maybe official routes, unofficial routes. A lot of them aren't documented. Obviously they didn't have ordnance survey maps, so we don't really know exactly what routes they did take. Possibly they had local guides, because if you hired, say, a local guide from a hostelry who would take you on to the next one, then you'd be able to find your way, because without maps and things, and a lot of people couldn't read or write, they must have relied on lots of local knowledge. So there's all sorts of things. There's whole areas of research there that could be done by people, and going into original sources, perhaps finding out more about these routes, and then obviously making them more accessible today, because as you say, if they're not accessible, people won't use them. If they're on main roads, people won't use them. They have to be on paths, by riverbanks, like walking by the Lee Valley, for example, and that type of thing. So that's a really, really useful thing. I was reading recently about Pilgrim Cross, or Student Cross as it was, in 1948, and it was founded by men. It wasn't women, it was actually men, hate to say, but it was men, who walked from as far away as Middlesbrough, and Wrexham in Wales, for example, all the way to even up to 200 miles, carrying an oak cross about 3 meters tall. And that was the origin of it. And it took them a long time, but they mainly seemed to stay at Catholic churches. There were more Catholic churches in those days. But it was quite incredible in 1948, without proper sort of wet weather gear that we would wear today, that they walked this route and they got there. Because I was reading newspaper articles from the actual times, and where they were staying and things like this, and where people were welcoming them and walking some of the way. I was reading about Grimsby and Cleethorpes, and how local people walked with them some of the way, and that sort of thing, made a big fuss of them. And when I did Student Cross, it was all very, very well planned. We stayed in parish churches, well, mainly church halls, and very welcoming locals, often who would cook food for us and see to our needs, and couldn't be more hospitable. And this was like the medieval tradition of that. And I remember being given hot cross buns on Good Friday in one village. This was a tradition that ladies would come out with fresh hot cross buns for us all, and things like this. And that was amazing experience for me. And also it was with a group of about 10, 12 of us, I would think, all of a similar age. And it was tremendous fun. You know, we had lots of fun. It wasn't serious. I mean, we sang hymns and things like that, but we also sang a lot of other songs. But it was companionship and really good fun. So I've this year and last year I did a bit of the Oxford leg. I was only able to do one day each this year and last year. But this year we took a route which came through our village, in fact, which is quite nice. So we walked from Bicester to Banbury, which is about almost 20 miles. But we walked through my village, which and then I guided them on footpaths and so on, ancient footpaths and things like this, which I quite enjoyed doing. So I'll hopefully do that again. And if I had more time to spare, I would definitely do it, but I haven't at the moment. So, and you're doing a talk for us in our AGM, I think, in I think October, end of October, I think it is, or whenever the date is.
Yeah, that's going to be wonderful.
So that should be really good. Excellent. Right. So shall we, thank you very much, Andy. Shall we move on, if possible, to Dr. Phil McCarthy? So, Dr. McCarthy, how did you come to be involved with pilgrimage?
Yeah, thanks, Tim, and thanks for the invitation. It's good to see friendly faces and names around the screen. Yeah, I first remember becoming interested in long distance walking when I was about 7 or 8, sitting in the back of our family Morris Minor and seeing a man by the side of the road striding along with a big white beard, old jacket and flapping coat and a rucksack on his back, and asked my dad about him, and he said, well, he's probably a tramp, maybe someone who had survived the Second World War and was just walking now. But I thought he looked fantastic, and I thought I want to tramp from place to place. I want to carry just what I need and always be on the move. And my sort of life went on. I pestered family and then friends to go distance walking with me, joined the Youth Hostel Association, did a lot of that, and then walked the Pennine Way with friends after O-levels. I wasn't able to do much for many years because of kids and family and stuff. I was a GP in Bristol for many years. But then in 2008, we were able to take an elective after every 7 years. I've been there 20 years, so I reckoned it was time for an elective, and I took 3 months off, and I walked on my own from Canterbury to Rome. And that was an amazing experience to walk that 1,200 miles over the Great St. Bernard Pass, down through Tuscany, and to do it completely on my own. And in fact, through the whole of France, I only saw one person walking the Via Francigena, and he was going in the other direction. So we just waved at each other, and on we went. I went back to work, and then I retired from being a GP in 2014 and was starting to think about what to do next, because I was in my mid-50s, and decided to do another walk. So I decided to walk on from, more consciously as a pilgrim this time, from Rome to Istanbul. And on the first occasion, people had always said to me, well, is it a pilgrimage then? When they heard I was going from Canterbury to Rome. And I'd always said, well, I'm not sure, because I don't know what pilgrimage means in the modern age. And I didn't want to be sort of pigeonholed into ideas of piety that might be sort of imposed on me. So I rather demurred, but I realized that I became a pilgrim the longer I walked. And the second experience was even more so by the time I got to Istanbul. And after that, I took up a role for 5 years, actually working within the church, and then retired from that and decided what to do next. And it was a beautiful summer's day. I decided to walk from Clifton Cathedral to Glastonbury, which is the Dustin Shrine. And as I went along, surrounded by wildflowers and the birds, and I thought, this is what I want to do. This is what gives me energy. I thought of loads of things to do in retirement, most of which I found a real downer, actually. And so I decided this is something that would give me energy and enthusiasm to carry on and make some sort of contribution. So the idea came to me then of the Hearts in Search of God project. And my idea was to create a pilgrim way from each diocesan cathedral to a shrine within the same diocese. And that involved me in quite a lot of sort of desktop research, finding out where the shrines are, because there is no national list, and then working out the routes. And it struck me as a good idea, not in terms of just what I wanted to do, but it is a way, as I think we've already touched on, that the church can connect with the modern world. We've all seen the pilgrimage celebrity TV programs, the most recent one on Fatima, and we can see how this is somewhere. So if people won't go to church, at least they can connect with the idea of pilgrimage. It also seems to me that it's a good idea in this age of global warming to think about not jumping on a plane or even on a coach, but actually to go on foot and to use public transport. And also, I was thinking that after the COVID pandemic, it's really important for us all to reconnect, with the natural world and with each other in social groups, and particularly for young people who were so badly affected by the pandemic. And then I saw a quote from Pope Francis, which sort of brought it all together. He said, whoever they may be, speaking of pilgrims, this is, whoever they may be, young or old, rich or poor, sick and troubled or curious tourists, let them find due welcome. Because in every person there is a heart in search of God, at times without being fully aware of it. And I thought that was a beautiful quotation. I loved in particular the phrase heart in search of God. And so I decided to adopt that for my project. So if you'd like to find out more about the project, then visit www.pilgrimway.org.uk. I'm very grateful to, in fact, everyone on this call, Anne, Tim, Andy, and John, because they've all contributed to the website, all written stuff for me already, which is absolutely fantastic. So otherwise, it's a rather lonely project. So I've recruited a great team to support me, and also I'm recruiting people to promote the ways in each diocese. So hopefully they can do that. So just to tell you a little bit about where the routes go, I've planned a route from all the cathedrals to a shrine within each diocese. I've also included the cathedrals of the armed forces and of the Ukrainian and Syro-Malabar eparchies, and also a church of the Ordinariate, so no one is left out. There are 41 shrines that I could identify around the country, and I've tried to include as many of those as possible within the walks. The walks mostly go from one day, which is the shortest one in Hallam, to about 6 days, which is the Shrewsbury Walk and also one in Menevia. They take in some of the big places, Canterbury, Walsingham, Holywell in North Wales, and Glastonbury, but also recusant houses, some forgotten holy wells, particularly one like Holystone up in Northumberland in the Cheviots, some beautiful countryside, and there's one walk which a family called the Robinsons have contributed, which goes from Lancaster Cathedral north through the Lake District, taking in some of the most fantastic scenery in the country. And also it's just some interesting and unusual places. So the Nottingham Walk ends up at Mount St Bernard at the shrine of the Blessed Cyprian Tansey, who was a Nigerian who lived and died at the monastery. And I've come across, as I've started to walk the ways, some extraordinary places. So far I've walked 8, or is it 9? Can't remember, out of the 22 walks. But I came on the Arundel-Brighton Walk. I stopped overnight in a little town called Storrington, and there was a former priory there, which was in fact mentioned in a Hilaire Belloc poem, which my mum was able to quote to me at great length when I returned. It was a priory. It's now home of the French Chemin Neuf community, served by a married Lebanese priest of the one of the West Syriac rites, who actually says Mass in Aramaic, and they welcomed a Ukrainian family. So if you ever wanted to demonstrate the Catholicity of the Catholic Church in one small sleepy English town, it was there in that little community there. So I hope you'll have a look at the website, maybe think about doing some of the walks, and thanks very much for listening. Very pleased to be.
Well, that's really interesting. Interestingly, you talked about your walk on the continent. The word saunter, of course, comes from Santerre, the Holy Land. Pilgrims, of course, would saunter. And people, they would say, where are you going? Santerre. Oh, so we get the word saunter from Santerre. So, pilgrimage is deep within the European psyche, not just in England and Britain, but throughout Europe, really. And many parts of the world as well have their own pilgrimage traditions. And of course, many parts of, say, North America have pilgrimages, and Australia and various other places. I think we have somebody from Sacramento joining us this evening, for example, and perhaps they know of local pilgrimage walks in their area as well. It is a fascinating area.
Sorry, Tim. I invented my own word
Yeah.
walking through the most remote bits of southwest France, which
Yeah.
was trudgery,
Yeah,
which is
yeah.
a mixture of trudging and drudgery.
Treasury.
So
Yeah, you should copyright that word, and it should be
I've tried to, yeah.
now, I think. Yes, before anybody else pinches that,
Yeah.
put it on the website and tell everybody. Yes, I first went to Lourdes, aged about 10, I think, with my mother on a diocesan pilgrimage, and was fascinated by it. And it was really interesting. I nearly set fire to a priest there in the candlelit procession. And the following autumn, he turned out to be my form master at school. So luckily, I didn't set fire to him. Otherwise, it could have been slightly embarrassing. He probably would have said, "Yeah, you're the one who set fire to me in Lourdes." But yeah, it sounds really fascinating, some of the things that you've done, and hopefully I will be involved with more things to do with the project in due course. And Walsingham, as you say, is very important, because Andy's mentioned Walsingham and I've mentioned Walsingham, going to Student Cross, for example, and it's a very, very important place for Catholics, linked with the dowry of Our Lady and so on. And is now the premier place really of pilgrimage, probably for Catholics, I would think. I've been asked to be keynote speaker at an ordinariate gathering of priests in November at Walsingham, and one of the things I'm going to talk about is pilgrimage to Walsingham and the Langham Madonna, which I've written about in an article before, and how I think the actual statue from Walsingham has possibly survived and is in the V&A today, but I can't prove it. And I've also been asked by the Centre for Marian Studies to do a Zoom talk as well later this year on that subject. So it's a fascinating thing, and a lot of people are interested in Walsingham and pilgrimage generally. So it is becoming much, much more popular through various different means. And of course, walking is becoming more popular as a cheap pastime for a lot of us, really. So thank you very much, Phil. So shall we move on to Dr. Anne Bailey now, who's joining us? And Anne, I don't know whether you can hear us.
Yes, can you hear me?
But yes, we're
Excellent.
loud and clear. So what's your interest in pilgrimage and your involvement in it?
Right, first of all, I'd like to say thank you so much for inviting me, Tim, and hello, Andy, Phil, and John. It's nice to see you. Yeah, so I'm actually a medievalist at Oxford University, although I first became interested in pilgrimage really because of sort of my hobbies and my interests earlier on in life. I've done a lot of backpacking, just carrying a few belongings around with me for months and sometimes years, traveling very lightly. Also long distance walking. I did a lot of long distance walking in the 1990s, and I've always been interested in different religious cultures and practices. And this all came together when I became a medievalist. And there's this wonderful course when I was doing my master's at Bristol on medieval travel and pilgrimage. And I did this wonderful, wonderful course and discovered a fantastic source called Miracle Collection. So these are miracle collections, which are collections of stories describing miracles that have happened to men and women and children going to local saint shrines in England. And they're fantastic because in this period in the 12th century, there are very, very few sources actually describing ordinary men and women. You know, they're usually much more higher class and sort of the elite that you hear of. So I was just dragged into pilgrimage then. Ended up doing a doctorate on female pilgrims in 12th century England. And then after that, I became very interested in the anthropology of pilgrimage, something that John Eade, he inspired me very much in looking at this. And I started going on pilgrimage myself, modern pilgrimages, of course. So really my research covers three types of pilgrimages, I would say. I go to pilgrimage destinations on my own. For example, I go to cathedrals. Quite recently, I was at Lichfield Cathedral because I'm always also very interested in Anglicans that have acquired relics. And as you probably know, there's a relic that was apparently it's been borrowed from Birmingham Cathedral and is now installed in a rather wonderful shrine, as I discovered, in Lichfield. So I went to have a look at that. I recently went to Ireland, and as far as I was concerned, I saw my three most favourite shrines that I'd heard so much about. I climbed Croagh Patrick, which is much tougher than I imagined. I went to Loch Derg, and I was actually invited onto Station Island by Father Le Finn, which is actually a wonderful experience. And I went to Knock Shrine. So these are the sort of places that I go to without it being, sort of a personal visit more than anything else. As well as I participate in pilgrimage events, sort of, for example, Walsingham, the annual pilgrimage at Walsingham I've been to, the Anglo-Catholic ones at Glastonbury, and Holywell, I think somebody mentioned just earlier on. And Catholic shrines, Ladywell near Preston, and Carfin Grotto, which is near Motherwell. Those are fantastic for me because they have a great treasury of relics. And coming from an Anglican background, relics for me, they're kind of really exotic and interesting, especially as a medievalist. I get to read about relics, but it's very, very rare that I actually get to see a relic myself. And then the other kind of pilgrimage I do pilgrimage walking, of course, because pilgrimage isn't all about walking. It's also been as a destination, because you can have a destination event, which is also a pilgrimage. But I do a lot of pilgrimage walking. In 2019, I walked the Camino Francis, which was probably the longest, definitely the longest pilgrimage I've ever done. But I participate in usually group pilgrimages because I can get to chat to people. I've been on Dominican pilgrimage. I went on a couple of legs of the COP26 Christian pilgrimage a couple of years ago. You might remember those. And quite often pilgrimage launches. The Eden Way was launched last summer, so I joined a group and went on that. So so my research on pilgrimage sort of covers all of this. And also I'm interested in not just in, as coming from an Anglican background, not just Protestant pilgrimage, but also Catholic pilgrimage. Occasionally I go to Orthodox pilgrimage as well. And I'm also very interested in secular pilgrimages and people who are spiritual but not religious. So I also went on a British Pilgrimage Trust pilgrimage, which was very interesting at the beginning of the year. I was invited by the Church Times to go on it and do a little piece for them, and so that was a very interesting experience as well. So I'm kind of very, very broad in what I'm interested in, but although I kind of term it pilgrimage from a Western tradition, so it's very much kind of it's very English based because I'm based in England. It's easier for me to do this kind of pilgrimages, I suppose. So I don't go more broadly. I don't look at Muslim or Hindu pilgrimages. So it's very kind of what I call from a Christian tradition.
Very interesting. Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned about relics, because of course in the 16th century relics were often scattered, destroyed, lost, buried, various things in many churches and cathedrals in the country. And yet, as you say, at Lichfield recently they've borrowed some relics, small relics of St. Chad from Birmingham Cathedral. And there are some relics in other Anglican churches and cathedrals. I was thinking Llandaff, for example, St. Tylo at Llandaff, Cardiff, where there's the skull of St. Tylo.
St. Albans, of course. I was at St. Albans pilgrimage just last weekend, and they acquired a relic in 2002, I think. So that they've had a relic there for quite a while.
Yes, and I was thinking about St. Dunstan's in Canterbury, where they've got the head of Thomas More, although apparently...
It's a bit controversial, isn't it?
Controversial, that one, really, because the church there doesn't seem to value it very much. But there's another church in Kent, the name of it escapes me temporarily, where they have the relics of a saint that was encased in a wall, and they've recently sort of trying to decide what to do with them. I forget the name of the church. It was definitely in Kent anyway. But there's a renewed interest in the relics of these saints, and why not? Because they were holy people, they were ancestors of ours in a way, and ancestors in the faith or whatever else. But I remember once going to Downside Abbey many, many years ago, and monks telling us it was a Benedictine, was Benedictines, but I think they've moved out now, told us about relics. And we went to this sort of ordinary looking wardrobe, because I can just describe it as being like a wardrobe, where there was a bunch of bones, and he said, oh, these are relics. It was just like, he was just showing us this sock drawer. It was just like, it just didn't seem terribly important. It was just like a collection of bits of bone and things like that. I just thought, well, shouldn't they be in some kind of reliquary or something rather? I just found that rather surreal, actually, that their attitude didn't, probably they didn't even know who they were, some of them. I don't even know where they got them from either. But it'd be interesting to know what happened to them.
Yeah, it's quite interesting going to where was it? sorry, the one in Preston, Ladywell.
Ladywell, yes.
Yeah, because I went there during COVID, and I
Yes.
wasn't allowed up into the relic room, but I'd sort of sweet talked the priest who just happened to be along, so I got a kind of guided tour of the relic room. It's just amazing. You just walked in, there were like cupboards all the way round and cabinets just absolutely bursting full of relics and little relics, and some of them were so tiny, and they all had labels. It was just, you know, I was just fascinated by it.
Yes, and you mentioned briefly Wales as well, and pilgrimage in Wales is taking off as well. There's the Penrhys pilgrimage that goes from Llandaff to the statue of Our Lady of Penrhys, and there's in an Anglican church at Pwllheli, there's a shrine there as well, a statue that's been about 5 years ago was designed by, in fact, a Catholic sculptor of Our Lady at this church at Pwllheli, and it's the centre of a sort of a local cult now, actually, among Anglicans, and they have pilgrimage walks to a local well and that sort of thing, and they take it very, very seriously. And it's interesting because that's the area my mother grew up in as a child. She grew up as a Methodist. Her grandfather who brought her up would be appalled by the idea of statues of Our Lady and relics or anything of that sort. He would have been absolutely appalled. He was very much the Welsh Methodist, you know, so he couldn't even do knitting on a Sunday because that was not God's work. You had to read your Bible and go to church 3 times, literally. My mother became a Catholic. Yeah, it is taking off, and it's becoming more and more popular. I mean, a mixture of walking routes, because I mean, long distance walking, we've mentioned things like Pennine Way and various other walks. I mean, my brother years and years ago did a lot of these long distance walks. I've never done one of them myself, but they are becoming more and more popular. And if you link them with the idea of traveling for a purpose to a place, whether it be a spiritual place associated with Christianity or whatever else, then at least it gives you a purpose and it gives you an end. And I think it's a great experience. It's relatively cheap. It's good exercise. It's fresh air. Doctors would recommend it, I'm quite sure, because it's good for you. So why not? So I think it is great. I think you've done some brilliant work and popularizing pilgrimage in many ways. So well done. That's great. Shall we move on to Professor John Eade, if that's right? Thank you very much, Anne, for your contribution. Wonderful contribution. Professor Eade, I think you're there.
Yes, I am. Yeah,
Excellent.
I'm enjoying
Brilliant.
very much listening to all this wonderful range of experience and information.
Yeah. So how come you came to be interested in pilgrimage? You're interested in anthropology, aren't you, and sociology?
Yeah, my first degree was history.
See.
And then yes, that's right. And then I was able to do the diploma in social anthropology, and in my 4th year, and I had taught in Zambia before I went to university. So we had an option either to specialize on African anthropology, which was very, very strong. One of the great the professors there was a guy called Evans Pritchard, who is one of the great founders of the discipline, really, in Britain. But I thought I'd want to learn more about India, partly because it was less dominated by British colonial influence. That was my assumption anyway. So in 1970, I went to Calcutta, and I lived with a Bengali Muslim family who were Sufi Muslims. And I got very interested in the role of Sufism and the Khanqa, which is a place where pilgrims come to look for healing and all the kinds of things that were very similar to Catholicism. And they also had been, the father and the son had gone to St. Xavier's College run by Jesuits. So we had this wonderful kind of multi-religious, multicultural dialogue. Anyway, so I largely in my career have worked on migration and multiculturalism, particularly focusing on the settlement of Bangladeshis in London. But I joined as an undergraduate the Oxford pilgrimage to Lourdes, So unlike most of the theme today where we went walking, the main point was get to the destination and to work there as a volunteer helper. And so I did that from 1968 to 1992. So I did 24 years straight off. And then I had time out for about 21 years. And then I went back again. Gosh, time goes by. Anyway, I did another 8 years. And the advantage of that was really to see how Lourdes had changed. Because one of the issues about anthropology or sociology is that we tend to take snapshots, we just do a kind of field work or maybe a year or 2 years. But we don't do the kind of long durée that historians are able to do. So in a way, I've been able to kind of be an historian, even though I'm an anthropologist. So anyway, coming back to how I got drawn into the anthropology of pilgrimage, in my innocence, in 1989, I organized a 3-day conference at Digby Stewart College, which now is part of Roehampton University. And I just wrote round to people. There was no internet or anything like that, and people just came. And what was and out of that, and what I had really experienced working as a helper, primarily in the baths, actually, was the ways in which different meanings, different understandings, different practices all coexisted. And people often had very strong views about how things should be done. And other people also had very strong views about how things be done. So it made me think that the sacred was very much a site for differing opinions or contestations. So hence the book Contesting the Sacred, which emerged out of that 3-day conference. And so what I was really hitting against was the assumption that there was just one motivation, or there was just one facet to pilgrimage. That it was all about getting away from the world, being in the technical language, a liminal space, on the edge of society, going back into society. That model is a very powerful one. And of course, it speaks to the notion of, solidarity, universal humanity, which is very powerful impulse. But there's another side that often just gets left out because it's a bit inconvenient, doesn't quite fit into this, if you like, a kind of dominant way of looking at pilgrimage. So that book actually hit a nerve at the time. This was the 1990s, and I think it reflects the way that society was changing in the 1990s. But I largely worked on, as I say, migration, multiculturalism, and then I met a very fine colleague called Simon Coleman, who works in Toronto, and he brought me back into pilgrimage. I suppose he's an expert on Walsingham, actually, from anthropology of pilgrimage, and we together got very interested in the kind of the notion of pilgrimage as movement. So we produced a book called Reframing Pilgrimage, which engaged with the kind of ideas of walking, of moving, movement more generally. And since then, I've largely broadened my network, which of course is helped by the internet. So I have been working very closely with colleagues across continental Europe, and also around the world. So I've largely been a kind of networker working with younger scholars. And that's drawn me into a very interesting phenomenon of the way in which pilgrimage now has become more acceptable in the Reformation in Northern Europe. So Norway, for example, has a whole variety of routes now going to Trondheim. And in the Baltic states, I'm working with a young anthropologist where Estonia, Latvia, well, Lithuania is of course Catholic majority country, but Latvia, Estonia are also inventing caminos in the model that you're talking about. So clearly a pilgrimage, as people have mentioned, does resonate today. And there's all kinds of historical blocks that have now been dismantled. And I think the last thing I wanted to say, because obviously we've only got 25 minutes now, so I want to open it for questions. The other thing that I've been really working on is with a scholar in Jerusalem who has invited me to think about reversing the way that we look at pilgrimage. We tend to think about pilgrimage as about people, about humans doing things. And quite a lot of work now has been looking at it the other way. How are we affected by the environment, by the path, by the nature that we move through? And with Anne was unable to come, but Phil came to a little workshop we held recently, where I was thinking about in Lourdes how candles act as a very powerful way of telling us that we are pilgrims. So people buy millions of candles. It's a major, source of income, but it's also it's a way of shaping our own experience of pilgrimage. So, and then I was thinking about working in the baths where people take their clothes off. I don't know if you did that, Tim, but
yes. Very cold.
Yes, very cold. But
Yeah.
I was very interested in the way that the towels have their own agency. As you know, the water's incredibly cold. So the kind of sensational, emotional part of
sensual experience.
Yes. And also in a way it, you suddenly realize that the rather rotund Italian person was a bishop as he came in, and now he looks like everyone else. So that kind of reversing the way of looking at pilgrimage, I find very fertile. So I think that's probably enough from me. Thank you.
I think the idea of equality on pilgrimage is quite interesting, because in the Muslim tradition, on the Hajj, where they all wear white, it's the idea, I think, is that everybody is the same. It's a bit like school uniform in a way, that your identity is lost, but you become part of the group, part of the crowd. You kind of melt into the whole, really. And that's another sort of way of looking at pilgrimage. In that sense, everybody is equal. It doesn't matter if the person's a bishop or runs a bookshop or whatever else. I don't know, bus conductor or something. They're just kind of another person who's going on the same journey for same or different reasons. But essentially, you're kind of united with something. There's something uniting you with that person.
Yes, but at the same time, there are subtle ways of differentiating, that people have, saying, well, I mean, the bishop did look rather scandalized when we were treating him. So it wasn't so equal after all, that was an element of it. But, he still remained a bishop, even if he just had a wet towel around him.
Yes. Interesting. It's given me a picture of a bishop now, with sort of a rotund bishop with a cloth round him, sort of thing. It's kind of, I can't get that out of my mind now. Next time I see a bishop, I should be thinking about that. Hopefully not, though. Interesting, you mentioned about the Baltics. I know Dr. Francis Young is very interested in doing work on the Baltics and sort of local traditions and sort of witchcraft and spirituality and things like that. So I don't know whether that kind of links up at all in any way. He's going to do a talk for us next year as well. It was reading something by him that sparked me off on the interest in Walsingham, actually, and the Langham Madonna in particular. And I've discussed it with him, sort of thing, and Father Michael Rear as well. It's an interesting thing, and the idea that some of these statues, which were of great value in the medieval period, may possibly have survived. Certainly the one at Ipswich appears to have done in southern Italy, appears to be there still. And as I say, I have a suspicion that the one in the Langham Madonna in the V&A possibly is, or very similar to, the one at Walsingham I've examined, well, I've looked at it and I've photographed it from different angles. I've tried to engage the V&A in a discussion about it, but they don't seem to want to talk about it. But that's a fascinating thing for me, I think, to think this could be possibly something that was venerated in the medieval period by 500-600 or more years ago, and still survived, is quite an interesting thing, because although there's so much paraphernalia to do with the pilgrimage cults, the saints cults, the relics and so on, was destroyed, was totally destroyed and obliterated. Some things may have survived. Certainly the faith has survived, and some of the objects possibly, even occasionally things turn up, you know, crucifixes and various items and things of that sort. And I know there are people doing work on material objects from that sort of period and survival. Or possibly more things will turn up in due course, who knows really, but
yes,
it's a fascinating thing.
I just wanted to say, Tim, the previous discussion about relics and reliquaries.
Yes.
I went to one of the events around St. Bernadette's relics tour that took place last year. And I was fascinated by how people weren't really sure how to approach the reliquary, you know, and because it wasn't part of a mass, there was no set ritual. And in fact, it ended up in a kind of great selfie quest, a selfie fest. Someone pulled out their mobile phone, and a helper said, "Oh, would you like a photograph with Bernadette's?" And eventually, everyone got into all this, you know, and that's a kind of familiar way of approaching things that you can't quite know how to behave towards.
Whereas if you go to the Orthodox tradition, there's very much a continued tradition of people kissing icons, ancient icons, that sort of thing, and people know exactly how to behave. Even in Russia, even despite so many decades of communism, people still value and venerate holy icons and know how to behave. But of course, a lot of that's been lost in Western Europe, and particularly in England or in Britain generally. But perhaps will change. I mean, the Good Friday ritual of venerating the cross, creeping to the cross, and so forth, it is a kind of an echo of the sort of medieval traditions of relics and veneration and so on. I think, you know, it's one of the small echoes of that, really. But shall we move on to one or two questions anyway, or comments? So. So that's all right. Thank you very much, Professor Reed. That's fascinating, really interesting.
Okay.
So our wonderful Secretary Angie has said, someone in my area of Somerset, as she lives in Somerset, I think near Yeovil, I think, walked from here to Waltham Abbey, which of course is north of London, isn't it, Waltham Abbey? I think there was a relative of mine who was a bishop there a long time ago, actually, since deceased. He offered to do odd jobs for people on the way in return for a meal. So he obviously wasn't carrying much money or food. And not the sort of thing everybody could do. That sounds like a wonderful idea to be able to do that. And I've heard of people doing that. There was somebody on the continent I read about did that. Took no money and no food with him and travelled and told people about his story and was given food and lodgings all over. I think it was France. I can't remember the details, but it just thought it was quite an incredible thing to actually do. And of course, the sort of thing that medieval people might possibly have done. But you know, can you imagine turning up at a pub today saying, "I'm on a pilgrimage, can you give me a free meal?" I don't think you'd get very far, unfortunately. So the British Pilgrimage Trust has a sanctuary project, Philip McCarthy said, to encourage churches and others to provide simple pilgrim accommodation. Camping is becoming more popular, where the churches are become accommodation overnight. I've never stayed in one, but well, I've slept in church halls. I don't think I've actually slept in an actual church on pilgrimage, but that's becoming more popular, I think, especially as churches become more and more redundant. I know that our village church is struggling to keep going for lots of reasons. So Andy Bull said, yes, the Sanctuary Project, British Pilgrimage Trust. If you want to put a question in the chat box, please do. Other than that, I'm happy for anybody to ask a question out loud. But if you say who particularly you want to ask the question to, that would probably help. So would anybody like to ask a question?
Well, not a question so much, but it's. I want to speak to Anne. I wondered if she was aware of the fact that there is a relic of St. Thomas Becket in Northampton Cathedral, and I've seen it, and it will be on display this week, coming weekend.
Oh, I had no idea. No.
Yes.
Gosh, I thought I normally kept up with relic news and pilgrimage news, but I didn't know about that. So what's the background to this? Where's it come from, and why?
I've no idea. I mean, my attitude to relics is it might be, but it's what it represents that's the important thing. It makes you think. I don't know whether it's real or not. And I'm in no position to judge whether something is genuine, but I accept the reasoning behind it.
So Northampton. So which saint are we talking about?
Thomas Becket.
Oh, sorry,
Thomas
you said Becket. Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah,
I saw the Becket. I saw the relic of Becket when it came from where was it? It came to Canterbury and did the rounds of the churches about 10 years ago, and that was interesting because, of course, it's the relic of Thomas Becket at the Catholic St Thomas Church just across the road from Canterbury, and people were making a big fuss of this relic being borrowed and brought to Canterbury Cathedral without kind of realising that there was another relic of Becket just a few footsteps away. So yeah, but I didn't know about the Northampton one.
And there's also a relic of St. Augustine in St. Augustine's at Ramsgate. It's a new shrine. Yeah,
I've heard about that. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's interesting. Yeah, thank you so much.
Interesting. Yeah, we mentioned the relics of St. Bernadette, and I know Anne went to the Catholic Church in Bicester, and I was due to be there. I was meant to be a steward there. But then I had to go to Manchester, unfortunately, so that meant I couldn't be there. I was very disappointed, but otherwise I would have been there. As I say, I would have been stewarding people in and out of the church.
Yeah, it was interesting because I had a different experience to John, because John went when there wasn't a service, but I went to the reception when the relics first arrived. There was a procession, and I don't think there was a mass, but there was a service. So people it was much more kind of formal, and I didn't see people taking selfies of themselves. It's a very much more kind of regulated, and there was a rope across, and people were just going up and looking at the relic and saying a little prayer and then walking away again. So I found it really interesting that experience is very different to the one that John had. It was a different church, but because I was there when there was a kind of proper formal service, with kind of much more ritualized, I suppose, that people were just, that people were behaving rather differently.
Mm-hmm. There was a mass about midnight apparently there, so, which was apparently very, very full actually. I was due to be there, as I say, but I couldn't be, unfortunately. But it was very, very. I mean, people were coming from quite a wide area. Not just local people, and not all Catholics either, for that matter. I don't know much more about it than that, what people's experiences were. I mean, I know I've spoken to people in the parish, but I don't know about other people, what their experience was. But it did draw crowds, and that seems to be the experience whenever the relics of St. Bernadette moved around to different places in the British Isles. It seemed to draw a lot of crowds. So it does show something about an interest in relics, or in spirituality, or something. From a number of people who wouldn't ordinarily be churchgoers, I would imagine. So it must be engendering some kind of interest among a wider variety of people, I would say. So it's an interesting thing anyway. Is there
Sorry. So I was just going to say, I think Bernadette is very special because people love her and they feel close to her. A relic of Becket, somebody that died in horrible circumstances way back in history, they're kind of less interested in that. But because Bernadette, it's very kind of a romantic story around her and people love her. I think that's why she's so popular.
Yeah, that's right. And I get the impression that people wanted some kind of tangible relationship, and the selfie, although we might be a bit, lured outside the baths, actually, in my time at least, there was no photography. Very difficult to enforce that now, of course. But although we might be a bit snippy about selfies, we take selfies all the time, and they're a very powerful record of what's happening. So it also it was so recognizable that rather than embarrassed, kind of looking and bowing and not knowing what to do next, go and light a candle or something. This was immediately recognizable as a very modern ritual, if you like.
A mixture of the old and the new, really, the ancient and the modern in some ways. Is there anybody who wants to ask any other questions of any of the speakers this evening at all? Or make any points?
May I make a point to you, Tim? And that's to say thank you very much for pointing me in the right direction of the Langham Madonna at the V&A, because I went to see it. And as you say, it may be, we don't know, but I just sort of thought about it and thought, well, yes, you may be Our Lady of Walsingham, and I respected her and valued the statue for that.
You can see it's hollow.
Just on that subject, Tim.
Yes.
I was chatting briefly to a chap, I think it's called Father Rear, who's in Walsingham. And
I know.
He has been given a grant, and he has a research student who's now going to be spending a number of years, I think, researching the veracity of that story.
Right. Yes.
And he did mention a few specific things about the actual design of that, which is just like a wooden stump. But there's some significant things about it, apparently. So, for instance, many of those statues of Our Lady would have a band of wood which would have been painted gold. This one has a groove in which a gold crown would have been placed. Possibly you know all this already, but it does. There is actually some significant potential evidence about it. And I believe the V&A bought it for, was it 10 shillings and sixpence in 1923?
Yes.
Yeah.
And they don't know and any paperwork was lost in the Blitz. But yes, the groove that you say around the head, there's evidence of one of the kings, Henry, I think it was, gifted a crown to the statue, and you can see a groove where it appears to be the statue on the statue that there would have been a crown of some sort. It's hollow, it has dowels and dowel holes in the back, so I photographed it from different angles. My article is on the ECHA website, if anybody's interested, some while ago, a couple of years ago, I think. And as I say, I'll be talking about it through the Centre for Marian Studies at St Mary's University, Twickenham, sometime later this year. They're trying to get me to say a date. But I think the date they've asked me, I think I'm going to be in Walsingham or about that time. But I'll be talking about it then to them, and they seem very interested in it as well. I've since written an article which is purely about Walsingham and the Langham Madonna, taking out anything to do with the other statues. And it's not yet published, but it may be at some point, I don't know. But it is an interesting subject. But as I say, the V&A, I've tried to engage the V&A. But I spoke to one of the guides there who knew nothing, literally nothing about it, nothing whatsoever. And I emailed them about it, and they said, yes, we'll be in touch, and they never did. So I've not actually been able to engage them in a discussion about that, but there needs to be more work on it. But no, I've spoken to Father Rear in Walsingham about what I've done, and basically it was inspired by him and Dr. Francis Young originally. So it is an interesting thing. And of course, Father Rear has written his book on Walsingham as well, because I remember he was signing them when I was there once in Walsingham. He was signing them, so it's a very, very good, very detailed book about Walsingham. So yes, does anybody else want to ask any questions or make any points or whatever else?
And I surprised no one mentioned the Elsford shrine. It's one of my favorite. Well, it's my favorite shrine. I say partly because it's a beautiful location, but also it relates to one of the few saints that we produce, St. Simon Stock. The English don't produce many saints, and Cardinal Newman, we struggled to make him a saint. So partly I'm a a supporter of that pilgrimage, but also it's interesting because it's multicultural. There's been two Polish pilgrimages there since the Second World War. There's now a Tamil and I think an African Caribbean pilgrimage. So I see it as a very contemporary, representing changing Britain. That's partly why, of course, an anthropologist would say that, but I think it's still you can defend that statement. Yeah,
it's interesting, the multicultural element, because there are so many Catholics in Britain today from Southeast Asia, or origins of Southeast Asia. My own priest, I mean, many of the priests around this area are from Sri Lanka or India, and there's a great sort of Indian Catholic community in this country, and some of them go on pilgrimages certainly to Walsingham. I don't know other places, probably many other places as well, but they've very much embraced the tradition of pilgrimage to Walsingham. So that's kind of an interesting sort of take on modern multicultural Britain, really, that the pilgrimage has become a multicultural thing, as well as not simply the British historical tradition, but is a modern day thing for everyday people, ordinary people in anywhere in Britain. So it's an interesting sort of way of looking at it, really. Any other questions or anything before I kind of?
Well, if I can make another comment, Tim,
Yes.
because several people referred to the Anglican input in this, and how we've got the two shrines at Walsingham. I have a theory that it's, we've got a much more relaxed attitude to saints and pilgrimages than we did even, say, 100 years ago in England.
Oh, yes.
And I think we have the Oxford movement to thank for that, for this sort of reintroducing an appreciation of our church background and our historical background and our medieval background, which I think was lost for so many centuries. But and I think because of that, we've come back, and all the Anglican churches I know had their pilgrimage visitors to Walsingham, and I just think this is a good thing.
And also to many other cathedrals. So in Oxfordshire, for example, I know Anne knows about it, being on pilgrimage in Oxfordshire. So they have them to Oxford Cathedral. I think it's a fairly short walk, but I think there are also longer walks as well. And I mean, the local Anglicans here did short pilgrimage walks in Oxfordshire last year, because I was asked to do a talk to them at a little Catholic chapel of about 3 or 4 miles from here, and they were quite interested in the story about that, because I published an article on Catholic recency in North Oxfordshire, which includes this church sort of thing. So it links the present day with the past, really. And quite a few years ago, I set up British Medieval Christian Tradition on Facebook, originally as a page and then as a group. And the reason for that was to sort of link the past with the present, to make people aware of our country's historical background vis-a-vis faith and spirituality and tradition and things like that, and heritage. And I think on the whole it's been fairly successful. So I've run 1 or 2 groups, but that was the original one that I set up, and people contribute all sorts of things to that, shrines, churches, holy places, all sorts of things, places they've visited and places they've heard about, or things that are in the news and that sort of thing. So it is a question of letting people know and educating people as well. Also with the English Catholic History Association group as well, which I was asked to set up by the committee, is open to anybody. They don't have to be Catholic, they don't have to be in Britain, many aren't. But it's kind of linking people with the historical tradition and culture and heritage of the British Isles, really, and making people aware of that. And that's kind of a personal mission of mine in a way, really, a small one, but it's kind of something that I've been involved with for a few years now. And I think it's very, very important personally that we do understand our own culture and our own heritage and our own traditions, no matter what religious or other tradition that we may come from, really. So yeah, hopefully it's been very helpful. So if there's no other questions or whatever, I'd like to thank all the speakers this evening. It's been absolutely wonderful. And I'd also like to just mention briefly, if I can, some of the upcoming events. I've just quickly unlocked my phone. That's it, right, I've unlocked it. So some of the events that are coming up, for example, 11th to 13th of July at Durham, the Centre for Catholic Studies and the University of Notre Dame Conference on Popery, Politics and Prayer, British and Irish Catholicism. That's coming up, it's all on the ECHA website. Monday, 24th of July to the 26th of July, the Catholic Record Society Annual Conference at Hinsley Hall in Leeds. I'm going to be speaking on the first day, the first afternoon of that. And I'm from Leeds and I know Hinsley Hall, so it'll be quite nice. I'm going to stay with my brother for that. I'm going to meet up with some old friends as well. Tuesday, the 25th of July to the Saturday, the 30th of July is Harvington Hall History Festival. I wish I could have gone to that, but unfortunately I'm in Leeds. Many talks and presentations are planned for this exciting week. I think some of the speakers are people who've done talks for the ECHA as well this year. So that will be really interesting. Again, you can click on the link on the website for the programme for that. Tuesday, 1st of August, via Zoom, Conor Byrne, Queen Mary, Mary Queen of Scots, or Lady Catherine Gray. There's a talk on that. We had an excellent talk on Tuesday as well about the wife of Charles I. That was an excellent one we'd had 2 days ago. And September the 5th, we've got Valerie Shute, Anne of Cleves, the Survivor Queen, talk on that. Dr. Anne Bailey is talking in October, 3rd of October, on a journey on foot, a consideration of pilgrimage. So ideal for those who are interested in pilgrimage. Again, you can click on the Eventbrite link there on the website. Saturday, 28th of October, ECHA Annual General Meeting and Day Conference, the Loyola Room at the Church of the Immaculate Conception, Farm Street, is in Mayfair in central London. Andy Bull knows all about that because he's going to be speaking to us. And then you get to re-elect the committee of the ECHA. So hopefully I shall continue as chairman. Otherwise, somebody else will have to do it. 7th of November, we've got Joanna Bogle, The History of St. Mary's University, Twickenham. So there, it's a Catholic university there near London, in London. Tuesday, 21st of November, Linda Porter, is one of the greatest and most illustrious princesses in the world, a reappraisal of Catherine of Braganza. I think that was meant to be on a month or so ago, but she had to change it at very short notice, so it's been rescheduled. And 5th of December, we've got Ian Styler, St. Ethelthryth of Ely, also known as St. Etheldreda. I've written an article on her as well. It's on the ECHA website as well, if anybody's interested in that. And then we go into January, I won't go on, but January, February, March, April, there's lots of talks, lots and lots of talks. So if you're new to the ECHA, have a look on the website, or if you have attended talks before, please attend some more. They're all absolutely free. They don't cost a single penny. And they're often well worth it, and some very, very eminent scholars, writers, researchers, all sorts of amazing people, really. But thanks ever so much for our wonderful speakers this evening.
Thank you.
Andy and Phil and Anne and John, all been absolutely excellent. It's certainly, I didn't think we would go on as long as this, but we have. But I found it really interesting. I've jotted down 1 or 2 things to think about. And thank you so much for attending. I do hope you've all enjoyed it anyway. And do join us again another time, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye for now.